So there's this extremely common bit of folk wisdom that you'll often see get invoked to explain a lot of human behavior these days, especially when people are talking about their behavior in relationships, both social and romantic. And this idea is that your parents are very powerful shapers of your later eventual behavior and your psychology, molding us from a very young age, like we're made of clay, into a type of person that we're eventually going to become when we venture out into the wider world. So in some examples here, you're going to see that people will discuss their ability to form stable or unstable relationships in the romantic world rather, in terms of what they think they picked up from their relationship with their parents. So maybe you can't be there for your partner. And maybe that's because your parents weren't there for you consistently enough when you were growing up. Maybe you find yourself craving the attention and esteem of other people in the social world. You want people to look at you and be impressed. And maybe that's because your parents didn't pay enough attention to you when you were young, and so you grew up craving this fulfillment of an unmet need. Your parents didn't pay enough attention to you, and now you want to get lots of attention from other people. Maybe you even see that there are children that are being raised by single parents that appear to have different outcomes than children raised by their two biological parents. Well, that must be because the father wasn't home and you lacked a strong male role model growing up, or your mother wasn't around and so you didn't understand what relationships with women were going to be like, or you view relationships as unstable because your parents both weren't there for you when you were growing up. These intuitions are both extremely common these days, and they're very psychologically compelling explanations for behaviors. At least in certain cultures, in modern times, people find these appealing. It didn't always used to be this way. But part of this intuition, that parents are these big movers and shapers of children, no doubt, rests on this idea that everything about our biology must develop. That is, we have to go from a single fertilized egg and grow into this adult human body that contains trillions of cells. And in that respect, there are a great many hurdles of life that have to be overcome to successfully navigate this process. And the course of your eventual development of going from one to several trillion cells can be shaped by a lot of outside influences, especially when they act early in this process. For instance, we were reviewing in a much earlier lecture when we were discussing pregnancy sickness, this very phenomenon, which is that foods and chemicals that a grown mother might ingest, which are relatively benign to her currently adult developed body, can actually prove extremely damaging or even fatal to a developing body. That is, if you want to put this in a very concrete example that everyone understands, it's very bad for children's developmental outcomes if their mothers drink when they're pregnant with them. The mother's body can handle the alcohol, the developing fetal body typically doesn't handle it very well, and you end up with all sorts of negative outcomes if the mother has the wrong drinks at the wrong time. This can have very, very long-lasting impacts on development. So in a more metaphorical sense, you could take a look at this little river here. Not little, I suppose. But many people think of a developed body as something like an already established flowing river that's carved its path through the ground through a process of gradual erosion. And once the path of this river is set, it's very hard to shake the river from this established course. You take a little pebble, little stone, you throw it in this already flowing river. The river is fine, it's going to keep maintaining its shape, it's going to flow around the stone. However, if you take that exact same small pebble and you place it early in the development of this river before this erosion has taken place, then that small trickle of initial water might flow around the stone and it could actually guide the eventual erosion down an entirely different path. And many people, it would seem, view the influence of parenting a lot like these pebbles that you can place early in the flow of a stream. Or perhaps you could even think of parenting as putting a great many pebbles in the way of the stream, or even some large boulders, that you can really shape the course of development through how you parent your kids. And through these early interactions that children have about their parents, they're going to learn about the world, they're going to learn about how to behave, and they're going to carry all this knowledge into future relationships. Children, in this view, are socialized into the adults they're eventually going to become by their parents, shaped from a young age down courses that determine personalities, beliefs, desires, behaviors, romantic attachments, all of it. And it's the parents that shape the children into the adults they become. And this is because, as we might think, parents have the most access to these kids from the earliest ages. And because they're acting early in this development, they should be able to shift its course. All very intuitively plausible and all very common these days. The work we're going to review today, which derives from the book The Nurture Assumption by Judith Rich Harris, one of my favorite books, takes a substantially different perspective. And to quote her in the introduction, she says, quote, "The experts are wrong. Parental nurturing is not what determines how a child turns out. Children are not socialized by their parents. The nurture assumption is a myth, and most of the research used to support it is worthless." End quote. From this very plainly stated introduction, it's clear that Judith both has the perspective that these parental influences on how children turn out have been far overstated in their importance, as well as a personal tone when she expresses this, which captures me on a personal level because she's not afraid to call certain research methods flawed or their conclusions useless. Very plain, very understandable, frank language that I appreciate a great deal. Indeed, going further, Judith's claim is not even that parents have this modest, predictable impact on how children turn out, instead of the large one that people assume. She's not saying people think parents have this much impact, they actually have this much impact, but rather, to again use her words here, quote, her view is that parents have no lasting influence on their children's personalities or the way they behave outside of the home. End quote. Now, as she clarifies, she doesn't mean that parents are unimportant in many respects in our lives, but simply that they are not the hands that mold us and shape us into the people that we're eventually going to be when we're not around them. Okay. Parents are important, as are many different relationships that people are going to have throughout their lives, but not in the ways typically ascribed to parents. And as these claims are very easy to misunderstand, and because they seem so counterintuitive to many people when they first hear about them, today I want to give a broad overview of Judith's ideas, why she reaches the conclusions that she does, why so much of the research on parental effects is lacking, and what forces she proposes act as the socializers of children and the shapers of their eventual personalities. So in this context, when we say socialization, we're talking about the process through which a newborn child acquires all the skills and knowledge needed to function in the society they exist. These are things like learning to speak the language of those around them, what behaviors are appropriate and expected in what contexts, what skills they must develop to survive and thrive, what it means to be a man or a woman, and so on. Everything like this. These are things within a society that people share and tend to make them similar to one another. So really, you can think of socialization, broadly speaking, as the acquisition of culture. Personality, on the other hand, when we talk about this, are the psychological factors that make us uniquely us. What we personally enjoy doing, eating, wearing, what we think, so on. These are things that tend to make us individuals and different from others around us. And our socialization and personality together, the stuff that makes us similar to those around us and the things that make us different to those around us, make us into the complete developed adults we ultimately become. And these two things, socialization and the development of personality, Judith argues, are things that tend to not be provided by the parents. We can begin with an idea that we've reviewed previously, which is that all biology is shaped by this very complex interaction between our genes and our environments that the genes find themselves in. And everything, as we noted, has to develop, and this development is equally co-determined by the gene-environment interactions. How do your genes interact with your environment? These discussions here should never be focused on, is something genetic or is it not genetic? but rather how do genes interact with specific environmental inputs and why do they do that? Everything is to some extent genetically determined and environmentally determined, and this interaction cannot be pulled apart. But despite this, nature and nurture discussions are commonplace, where people really do try to separate out the different influences into different distinct domains. Yet when you hear the words nature and nurture, nurture is regularly taken to mean the influence of parents on their offspring. On an intuitive level, when people hear nurture, that's usually what they think of. Are you the way you are because of your nature, your genes, or because of your nurture? How did your parents raise you? Now, as Judith notes, the general form of most research attempting to find parental effects on children goes something like this. You look at a behavior that a parent does. You look at how a child turns out, and then you repeat this process until you have a large enough sample size to draw a statistical correlation, effectively a predictive connection, between a parental behavior and a childhood outcome. So for some examples here, parents who read to their children may in turn have children that do better in school. Parents that hit their children may have children that are more likely to be violent. Children from single-parent homes might be less likely to succeed than children from two-parent homes. And these are all findings that have been reported with some degree of regularity in the research literature. However, as anyone that's ever been attempting to discuss findings like this can tell you, and all good scientists get warned against in their introductory courses on science and statistics, correlation is not causation. Everyone's heard this before, but some people selectively forget it. That is, you will find correlations, a predictive relationship, between the sale of ice cream and the frequency of forest fires. But it's not because forest fires cause people to buy ice cream, and it's not because people buying ice cream tends to cause forest fires to happen, but rather because of an increase in environmental temperature that tends to cause both. When it gets hotter, people like ice cream because it cools them down, and when it gets hotter, you get more forest fires because it dries things out and they're more likely to catch. These correlations merely tell us that two things appear to be related in some way. It doesn't tell us that they are necessarily related in any cause and effect type of way, much less the direction of any hypothetical causes or effects. It just tells us these things are related. And as it turns out, much of the literature on how parents shape children appears to represent a variety of papers studying the correlation between ice cream sales and forest fires. They're just looking at correlations. Now, this is no doubt due to some practical difficulties, as well as, I suppose, ethical difficulties, which is that you can't randomly assign children to different parents and see how things turn out. And as a consequence of this, researchers need to take advantage of a lot of naturally occurring variation between parental behaviors and child's outcomes. Some parents read to their children and some parents don't. Some parents may hit their children and some parents may not, and so on. Pretty much through any parenting behavior you can imagine, people start studying this correlation between the parents and the kids. You gather enough of these parents and kids up, you see how the kids turn out, and you have the correlations that we just discussed. You don't have papers that are demonstrating parental behaviors are causing those outcomes. You have a lot of correlations. You don't have cause, but that hasn't stopped a lot of people from feeling like they've observed a causal relationship there. But her criticisms of this field extend far beyond the fact that most people are just doing correlational research, which is that she highlights a number of methodological and theoretical problems in this research as well. The first issue that you find with this type of research is pretty standard among most psychology research, and indeed a lot of research in general, which is that there's a bias towards publishing findings that turn up something, some relationship, and a bias away from papers that don't report any statistical relationships. That is, if you conduct some research and you find this correlation between parent behavior and childhood outcome, great, publish it. Did you not find a relationship between parental behaviors and children's outcomes? Well, now maybe collect some more people for your sample and run the analysis again. Maybe split it into boys and girls and see if there are different impacts for male and female children. Maybe look at 25 parental behaviors and 50 childhood outcomes and report on the 2 of those that ended up being statistically related to each other, and don't report on the other ones that didn't. Did you not find anything after you did all of this? Well, then don't publish your paper and throw it in the trash and move on, and no one ever knows that you didn't find anything. And given what we know about how well psychology research has tended to replicate in the past, which is a very fun story for another day, but right now it's worth mentioning that the answer is most psychology research doesn't replicate well at all. Most of the published findings in the literature should be interpreted as, to some degree, inflated in their importance. And as many findings in the field of parent-to-child outcomes tend to report relatively small effects, this should be a cause for some concern. But again here, the arguments against parents having these impacts on children is not simply the publication bias that plagues all of academic literature more generally. A much larger issue related to this topic is that interaction between genes and environment that we just noted. Specifically, it's true enough that most of children's early environments are provided by their parents, at least in some cultures, in some areas of the world in modern days. But it's also the case that these parents provide their children with their genes, at least most of the time. There are going to be some interesting exceptions that we get to shortly, and they're also very informative. But this important point is worth noting here, that parents provide both their genes and the parenting environment to the kid, because behavior is ultimately governed by this interaction between genes and environments. And genes that may encourage a certain type of behavior on the part of the parent also get passed on to the offspring as well. Again, consider a very simple case here. Let's say that parents hit their kids, and these parents tend to have kids that are more aggressive children. This is a finding that I would believe to be totally true, a correlation between parents hitting kids and kids being aggressive. So on the one hand, people might look at that finding and say that's because children learn to be aggressive by observing the behavior of their parents. They learn that the world is a violent place, they learn that violence is acceptable, that that's how you solve your problems, and that people who love you and take care of you may also express their feelings towards you through violence. That's one possible interpretation of this correlation. On the other hand, however, not all parents tend to share this same tendency to hit their kids in general, on a dispositional level. In other words, the tendency to hit your children, or probably to hit people at all, isn't just randomly distributed throughout the population. Those parents that have genes that may push them towards more aggressive behaviors give those genes to their children as well, as create more aggressive environments for the children. And you can run this same analysis for pretty much any other trait. For instance, tall parents likely have children that are taller than average. Parents with brown hair tend to have children with brown hair too. But that may have nothing to do with how they treated the children. The children probably didn't get taller because the parents were really attentive to them. They probably got taller because of some shared genes. And as such, if you're looking at this correlation between parental aggression on the one hand and children's aggression on the other, you have to consider this question as to why is the child similar to the parent? Are children just similar to the parents because they share genes with them? Are children similar to the parents because they've experienced this violent parental behavior? Perhaps that correlation is due to some other variables that we didn't even consider in this analysis yet, like ice cream and forest fires. We don't know what's causing what here. So the interpretation of these results that favors this causal arrow being drawn from parents' behavior to children's outcome, you just can't make it based on the study methodology that you're using. Another criticism of this research on parental impacts returns in an odd way to this idea that all behavior is determined by this interaction between genes and environment. The same general logic, Judith argues, should be said of parenting, inasmuch as parenting behaviors don't exist in a vacuum where parents are behaving and children are these little empty vessels. And all children are basically the same thing. But rather, parenting operates in this interactive way between the parents and the children, where children can actually evoke certain behaviors from the parents. They can pull those behaviors out of the parents. That is, parents do not, and indeed cannot, have a uniform way of responding to their children because their children aren't identical little creatures. That is, think about a parent that has two different children. One of these children is a very picky eater, and they'll throw violent tantrums if they don't get a meal that they like. The other child is a much more cooperative sort that'll eat basically whatever his parents give him without much complaint. When it comes to feeding time for these kids, this parent is going to appear to have some very different parenting styles for each of their children because of how those children behave. The cooperative eater is going to have many more pleasant interactions with their parent, while the fussy eater is going to have many more aggressive and confrontational interactions with their parents. Is it the case, then, that the parenting of the fussy eater should be considered aggressive parenting, and that the parenting of the cooperative eater should be viewed as pleasant parenting? Or should we be viewing the parents as reacting to these pre-existing differences within the children? In other words, rather than parents' behaviors causing children to behave in a certain way, it's also totally possible that children's behaviors are actually causing the parents to respond to them in certain fashions. Do harsh parenting practices cause children to become aggressive, or do very aggressive children tend to evoke harsh parenting practices because nothing else seems to work? Left with only this correlation between parents and children in terms of their behaviors, you have no way of determining what's causing what. And the larger point is here, once you replace this view of a child as being this passive receptacle with this idea that the child is an active participant in the parent-child relationship with its own wants and needs and behaviors, you end up getting a much different view on the research and the possible interpretations of these findings. Indeed, Judith references some of these previously held beliefs that we used to have about autism on this front. Specifically, it used to be thought that by some researchers that autism in children was caused by maternal coldness, which is effectively this idea that mothers of autistic children were behaving more emotionally distant towards the kids. And the mothers being so emotionally detached from their infants was causing these infants to develop autism. And the official term for this was actually refrigerator mothers. Your mom is making you autistic because she's not being emotionally responsive to you. However, as it turns out, this maternal coldness, this parental behavior, seems to have been a response of the mothers to the behavior of the autistic babies, because these autistic babies weren't doing things like making eye contact. They weren't smiling when they saw their mothers. They weren't acting excited to see them. And it was very hard for these mothers to be enthusiastic and excited about infants when the infants weren't at all exciting and enthusiastic about the mothers. Taking care of babies is a big, big job. And when that baby doesn't seem to care about you, that makes that very, very difficult to do. And the more we've learned about autism, the more it seems that the development of this condition has nothing at all to do with how the parents are treating their children. Yet at the time, autism was attributed to this maternal treatment of her child because this correlation was observed between the parents' responses to the children's behavior, but they assumed the causation was flowing in precisely the opposite direction. That is, it wasn't the mother's emotional coldness that was causing autism, it was the autism causing the mothers to respond in a colder way towards their infants. But Judith isn't merely content to criticize this research by mentioning that their methods are typically unable to draw the conclusions that many researchers would prefer to draw from them. That is, there's far more evidence that she brings to bear, demonstrating that we actually have solid evidence against this idea of parental impacts. Now, as I mentioned, parents usually provide children with both their genes and their parenting, which makes it very hard to separate out these factors. But there are some cases that are more unique. That is, in these cases, parents will provide two children with identical sets of genes, what we call identical twins, or the technical term monozygotic twins. These are children that, owing to some peculiarity of their development, divided into two separate people from a single fertilized egg. They share 100% of their genes in common with each other. And we also have these non-identical or dizygotic twins, which result from two different eggs being fertilized from two different sperm at the same time. But they're reared in the same womb, they're born about the same time, same hour, same day. And learning about these twins can be very informative about the role that shared genes play in making us who we eventually become. After all, if you have identical twins that look more similar to each other than non-identical twins, this suggests that increasing the number of shared genes increases the resemblance between people. And there are also cases where parents may provide children with their genes, but not with their parenting. That is, when a child is given up for adoption, the parents that rear them are not the same parents that provided them with their genetics. And situations like these can help us better tease out whether parenting effects exist and how strong they might be. That is, if adoptive children tend to resemble the parents who adopted them, or the other children they find themselves in the home with, like their adoptive parents' biological children, if the parents' biological and adoptive children all start turning out rather similarly, this might point towards impacts of parents. And putting these together, however, you end up with some really unique cases where you actually have twins that sometimes get reared in different homes. Rare as it might be, there are cases of identical and non-identical twins that have been given up for adoption, and each twin has been raised in a different home by different parents without knowing they actually had a twin. And just imagine that, the thought of someone out there in the world that was born to the same parents as you, they share 100% of the same genes that you do, but they're raised somewhere else by other people with a different set of parents, and you two never knew each other existed. Now, when such twin pairs are located, they can be rather informative about our estimates concerning what effects parents have on them. You have this kind of natural experiment of what happens when you raise the same kid in different homes. For instance, we might expect that identical twins reared in the same household are going to end up more similar than identical twins reared by different sets of parents in different homes. This is because when twins are being raised by the same parents, they should share more of these early rearing environments in common than the twins that are raised apart. And further, you're able to compare whether the adopted children end up more like the biological children of the adoptive home, or did the adoptive children end up more like their biological parents that gave them their genes but didn't raise them at all? If parenting is making children more like the people who raised them, more like the parents that provided the nurturing, you should see the most similarity among children raised by their biological parents, and less similarity between children and their biological parents when you raise them apart. Similarly, you might expect adopted children resemble their adoptive parents or their adoptive siblings more than random strangers. And further, if parenting is having an effect on all these children who share the same parent, again, you should see that these siblings are turning out more similar to each other than random strangers. Yet that's not exactly how the research tends to pan out. Generally, the data points to the following conclusions. As expected, when you increase the degree of genetic relatedness between people, the resemblance between them tends to increase as well. Genetically identical twins are more similar than non-identical twins or biological siblings. No real surprise there. What people might not expect, however, is that when children growing up in the same homes are not actually becoming more alike. That is, identical twins that were raised apart did not end up any more similar to each other than identical twins raised together. Sharing parents, apparently, is not making genetically identical children look like each other any more than not sharing parents. While genetic identical twins are not identical in their personalities and beliefs and behaviors and so on, they do develop somewhat differently. Being raised by the same parents doesn't seem to make them look any more similar. And that's a rather remarkable finding. Why aren't identical twins raised together looking more similar than those that are raised apart? There are differences between these twins, but those differences don't seem to be caused by their parents. While genetics are far from the full story here in explaining why people are who they are, that is, environments matter, and environments matter a lot when it comes to shaping our personality and socializing us, it doesn't seem to be the specific shared parental environment that actually matters. Environments matter, but maybe not that particular part of it in the way we think it does. Further, and this is a very important point, noting when it comes to this research looking at resemblances between children and parents, similarities between children and their biological parents should be expected to rise with age. And you can think about it this way. Your behavior when you were 5 is probably different than your behavior now. So try to imagine how your parents behaved when they were 5 versus how they behaved when they were raising you. There's probably a difference there as well. As such, there's probably a closer relationship owing to shared genes between 5-year-old you and 5-year-old your parents than there is between 5-year-old you and your adult parents. That is, sharing genetics should make us look more similar over time once you start to account for age. And this is important to bear in mind because even when there are occasional small resemblances found between adopted children and adopted parents, they tend to fade away over time. And as Judith puts it plainly, when she states that with respect to things like IQ and personality, the correlation between adult adoptees reared in the same home hovers around 0. So this leaves open the possibility, maybe, that parents are still affecting their children's development, but they're affecting it in relatively unpredictable ways that are unique to each child. That is, a parent being supportive might lead to one child being happy and conforming, while another child may respond to that same support by becoming broody and rebellious. But at this point, it becomes very hard to distinguish that possibility of parents affecting each child very uniquely and unpredictably from parents not actually having any effect at all. That is, if the same parenting behavior can make a child go one way or the exact opposite way, those tendencies would need to be so well balanced against each other that they basically completely end up canceling out. And also that you probably can't give parents any good advice at that time. Because if being really supportive can make your kid turn out in completely different ways, well then, you can't really advise that parents are always supportive, can you? And neither option here, that parents are either not substantially shaping their children's personality, or that they're shaping their personality but in completely unpredictable ways, neither of those ideas really tend to be how people view the effects of parenting in general. Naturally then, researchers began looking for the unique effects of parenting on each child in an effort to support this idea that yes, parents are actively shaping their children through their parenting, rather than just responding to pre-existing differences between children. They wanted there to be more to the story than this. And one place they tried to look for parental effects was in birth order. That is, there's a firstborn child, and then there might be a secondborn child, and there might be a thirdborn child. And there were some people that reasoned that there should be long-lasting, predictable impacts of parents on children with respect to the order that they're born, because the order that the children are born in should create some very consistent microenvironments. That is, firstborns should have parents that give them their undivided attention, more so than secondborns, because when there are two kids competing for parental attention, you have to split it differently than if there's just one. Further, parents should have more experience as a parent when they're rearing their second, third, or fourth child relative to their first, because the first child teaches them a lot about what it's like to raise children. They're trying to look for factors like this. And these factors of birth order, when examined, also turned up effectively nothing either, at least with respect to how the children eventually turned out as adults. First or early born children do not look predictably different from second or later born children when they grow up. And the higher quality this research is, that is, the more the research starts controlling for factors like socioeconomic status, family size, if they have a larger sample of children, the higher quality this research got, the less likely it becomes to find anything at all. Whatever results have turned up tend to be small in size, limited in scope, inconsistent in what they found, and generally not particularly useful if you're trying to make predictions as to how people turn out. Again, as Judith puts it, to use her words, quote, "Birth order effects are like those things you think you see out of the corner of your eye, but that disappear when you look at them closely. They do keep turning up, but only because people keep looking for them and keep analyzing and reanalyzing data until they find them. They turn up more often in older studies or smaller studies than larger or newer ones. They turn up most often when the subject's personalities are judged by their parents or their siblings." And that's going to become important in a second. But other factors have been examined as well concerning their overall family structure. That is, does whether the mother work or stay at home impact the eventual development of the children? Turns out it doesn't. Does whether the children enter daycare impact the eventual development of the children? No. Do unconventional family structures, such as homosexual parents, parents in open relationships, parents with atypical political beliefs, do those tend to leave lasting impacts on children? It seems not. What about children that were planned versus accidents? That is, children conceived through IVF, in vitro fertilization, artificial fertilization, where you basically cannot accidentally give birth to a child. You might expect them to have higher quality parents because they were all planned. Yet they turn out basically the same as children born through natural means. Now it is the case that children that are raised in single-parent homes may sometimes turn out to be different than those raised in two-parent homes. So, for instance, you have parents that are living apart because their relationship deteriorated, they got divorced. Children may turn out differently in that case. But again, is that because the parents who experience relationship failures more often tend to be different than the parents that stay together, and those parents, these different qualities are capable of being passed on to their kids genetically? What about the other factors that associate single parenthood, like economic ones that we're going to return to a bit later? How do those affect the development of a child? Unless you start controlling for these other factors, it's really hard to pin this idea that children raised under these circumstances of single parenthood turn out differently because of that parenting situation per se, rather than because of their similarities due to shared genes or other environmental factors. Now, I know all this probably is sounding pretty preposterous to some people, because you just know that parents have effects. After all, didn't your parents affect you? I feel like my parents affected me. Can't you recall a lot about your life that seems related to how your parents treated you? What about all these emotions and memories and feelings you have associated with your parents? Don't those matter? Yes, they do. You're right. There certainly are such effects that parents can create, but you need to know what kind of effects to look for and why. Specifically, when it comes to parental impacts, It has less to do with how parents shape the child across their life and all domains of it, and more to do with rather specific contexts. The impacts that parents have on their children do exist, but, and this is a critical part, they seem largely limited to the child's specific relationship with their parents. Put simply, parents affect children because children act one way around their parents and other ways when they're around other people. You and I do this all the time across many different domains of life, and it's completely normal. When I'm streaming, I'm engaging a different part of my personality than when I'm at work. I act differently around my parents than I do around my friends. I interact differently with romantic partners than I do with my boss. As we know, our brains are modular. They're made up of all these little different pieces, mental organs. And which of these are active and how they work depend heavily on our context. Some parts become more or less active depending on how hungry you are. Some parts become more or less active depending on whether you're experiencing sexual desire or physical pain. What we're motivated to do and how we behave is based a lot on the contexts that we find ourselves in. This is completely and understandably adaptive, by the way. What counts as adaptive in one circumstance is different than what counts as adaptive in a different circumstance, and our behavior and personality shifts to meet those different needs. And on a theoretical level, we can immediately appreciate why our relationships and interactions with our parents should not be expected to affect the way we behave when we are around others. And what we're going to do to understand this is reconsider what we've learned about altruism in a previous lecture. To recap very briefly, the selection pressure that maintains altruism, that is helping other people at a cost to yourself. One of the pressures maintaining this is known as kin selection. This idea that genes can aid in their own reproduction by supporting copies of themselves found in other bodies. As long as the costs, benefits, and degree of genetic relatedness work out properly, you can get the evolution of mechanisms that are favored to provide other people with benefits while you endure a cost to do so. Now, parents are defined by their genetic relationship to their children. And accordingly, that genetic relationship encourages parents to treat their children differently than they treat other people. Our parents tend to care more for us than for genetic strangers. But the flip side of this coin is that people with whom we do not share a close genetic relationship with should be expected to treat us differently than our parents. And this raises a very real issue, that behaviors that work or are appropriate during our interactions with our parents will not work or be appropriate during our interactions with other people. And if we attempt to generalize behavioral patterns from one relationship involving genetic relationship to a different social relationship that doesn't involve any shared genes, and assume that both of these are going to work exactly the same way and respond to the same behaviors with the same rules for the same reasons, we're likely making a mistake. Put simply, crying might bring the child's parents running to help it, but that same crying might lead that children's peers to scorn it and not want to hang out. Conversely, this genetic overlap between parents and offspring is far from 100%. And this means there are different adaptive best interests between parents and children. And given this partial lack of overlap of interests, we should expect that children that were heavily or even completely susceptible to parental influences or manipulations that shaped their psychology and behavior might be at a disadvantage. That is, if you could very easily be shaped by your parents, such learning mechanisms would be open to maladaptive manipulation by people that are promoting their own genetic best interests and not yours. As a quick example, parents might prefer that you share equally with all of your siblings, because from your parents' perspective, they are 50% related to you and your brothers and your sisters. But you're 100% related to yourself. you would usually rather have more for yourself than equally share between brothers and sisters, all else being equal. And kids that just listen to their parents and follow their behaviors would be making a maladaptive distribution in terms of their genetic best interests here. So any developmental systems that are too open to parental manipulation could end up with children that serve the adaptive interests of their parents rather than their own. So therein can reside the effects of parents on children. Children are going to learn some ways of behaving are appropriate when they're around their parents, and they will behave appropriately in that context. However, when children are not around their parents, they behave in different ways more appropriate for those situations. And in case that's too abstract, how many of you have ever thought about just coming home from work, you kick off your shoes, you change out of your uncomfortable work clothes, toss on some slippers and sweatpants instead? The situation between children and parents appears to resemble something kind of like that. What's appropriate behavior for home is not always appropriate behavior for work. And you change your clothes and your behavior accordingly. And so too do children change their behavior when they're around their parents versus when they're around other people. Indeed, as Judith notes here, the reports that teachers or daycare workers deliver about the children tend to vary in some rather important respects to what the parent says about that very same child. Many parents that may have attended, say, a parent-teacher conference night at school can no doubt attest to this phenomenon. You might have wondered if the kid the teacher was describing, they actually got mixed up, and it wasn't your child, they were actually describing someone else. Because the child they're describing seems a bit like a foreigner to you. Seems a bit like, my child doesn't behave that way, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, to be sure, sometimes the reports of parents and teachers about the same child do overlap. But that's largely because the child is still bringing its same shared genes into school and back home. The question isn't why there's any overlap between parents and teachers, but rather why that overlap isn't much larger than it is. The overlap between the teachers and the parents is usually a lot smaller than people might assume it is. And that answer, the reason why it's so small, again, depends on context. The context. When a child is at home, they may be smaller than their siblings, and they're almost certainly smaller than their parents. And in that context, physical aggression may tend to be a poor strategy for getting what you want because everyone's bigger than you. But what happens when that child finds themselves the largest child in their classroom at school? Well, in this context, suddenly the value of aggression can skyrocket. A well-behaved child at home may actually be a terror in the contexts outside of that home, precisely because the situations have changed and what they've learned in one context will not transfer well to another. And this raises another very important point for the methodology of research on children's development. That is, if you're trying to measure the personalities of children, especially young children, a lot of researchers, what they do is they just ask their parents to tell them about their children. They ask the parent to report about the children's behavior. After all, the parents have been observing this child for a while, and you should have an enhanced insight as to what your child is like. Especially if the child, isn't talking very much at that point. But what is it then that parents are really reporting on? Are the parents reporting on the child's personality, broadly speaking, or are the parents only reporting about the aspects of the child's personality and behavior that they observe? That is, how does the child behave around you? As it seems from a lot of the research, it's almost always the latter point. Parents are reporting about how the children behaves around them. And that can make some parental effects turn up. So the same thing is going to happen when you observe a child's behavior when that child is in the presence of their parents, as is frequently the case in a lot of research looking at young children. The parents bring the child to the researcher, and the parents hang out while the research is being conducted. This creates a context where the influence of parents on children should be expected to be at its highest. And you should expect to see influences of parents on children because the parents are there. They are around the children. And the children are behaving in ways appropriate for their relationship with the parent. Do that same test when the parent isn't around and the context is different, you tend to observe different results. And this is no doubt part of the reason why the intuitions about parenting effects seem so divergent from what's actually getting reported in the literature. Parents feel like they influence children, and they do. Children feel like their parents influence them, and they do. The issue, however, is that such influences appear limited to that specific relationship and do not generalize well outside of it. Your parents influence your behavior when you're around your parents, when you're thinking about your parents, when you're taking part in research at home around where you live with your parents. Step outside that home environment and all of a sudden behavior may begin to look a lot different. In fact, we've already seen an example of this before, a very clear example of how parenting influences do not leave lasting marks on their children, though it might have been difficult to appreciate this at the time we discussed it. That is, if you remember back to when we discussed language learning, there was a very interesting little tidbit in there which is going to bear very heavily on what we're discussing right now. As you might recall from that lecture, if you managed to catch it, there have been times throughout history where a variety of people from different parts of the world are placed into the same vicinity to work. Think about it as people from Germany, Africa, France, and Sweden are all brought to this island to work on a farm. None of these people speak a common language with everyone else in the group, but everybody needs to communicate with each other somehow to get the work done. And so to make this communication happen, they create what's called a pidgin. P-I-D-G-I-N. Not pigeon the bird, pidgin, which is a very rudimentary form of language. It doesn't really have grammar, but it serves as a good enough style of communication. So you might use a sentence that goes, "you good," to inform someone else that their work was acceptable. It's very basic, but it gets the job of communication done well enough for people to work together. When adults that are living in this area communicate using this shared pidgin, it doesn't tend to develop very far among the adults. However, when the young children in the area attempt to communicate with each other, that pidgin becomes transformed into what's known as a Creole, which is effectively a new full language with more complexity and grammar. Children are capable of creating a language from the pieces of one. And this is the important part. They seem to do so to communicate with other children, not to talk to their parents. Children in this case are learning to speak a language that their parents do not. In fact, they're sometimes creating a language to communicate with each other that doesn't yet exist. The native language of the parents, German, Swedish, French, whatever, the kids don't speak that language. The kids don't speak the pidgin that the parents communicate with. Those aren't the native language of these children. The Creole is, this new language that previously didn't exist that their parents do not speak. What's filling the role of language here is what kids talk with other kids, with their peers. Now, this might seem particularly odd to people because early in their life, before children are particularly mobile, they do seem to begin to learn language. As is in the case of my culture, here in America, most kids do tend to learn early language from their parents because the parents are the ones they hear talking the most. The parents are the ones that talk to them directly the most sometimes. Parents are overjoyed when their kids speak their first words, that usually these kids are learning from their parents. You might expect children will learn language of their parents, and indeed they do. At that time in their life, children will speak the language of their parents because that's the only environment they have. But what happens when those children leave the home environment and find other children that don't speak the language their parents do? That is, perhaps the parents are an immigrant family. They speak Spanish at home, but English is spoken by pretty much everyone else in the community that the family's immigrated to. As it turns out, in those cases, children effectively stop learning the language of their parents about the age they immigrated into the new culture and start learning the language of their peers. That is, the immigrant child we just described may speak Spanish with the competency of a 5-year-old if that's about the time they started spending more time outside the house with other peers that spoke English. They'll speak Spanish at about the competency of a 5-year-old, but their ability to speak English will continue to grow until they are speaking it as their native language, much to the frequent dismay perhaps of the parents that are watching their children effectively become foreigners to them. To put this in yet another example, if you have a child that's raised by deaf parents, and these parents are effectively not speaking the language because they haven't ever heard it, provided that child is not deaf themselves, their spoken language learning abilities don't end up being hampered as long as they can spend time around their peers. The deaf parents may not be able to speak to them, but children can learn the language of their peers with the competency of the same extent that children raised in the home of hearing, speaking parents normally do. If children were learning language from their parents, that is, if language was a parental input, we would not be seeing this happen. That we do see children not learn the language of their parents, but learn the language of their peers when the two differ, tells us something very interesting about the development of children and what forces in the world are actually shaping them into the eventual people they're going to be. And at least in the case of language, it doesn't seem to be the parents. We can also consider the matter of developmental stages when you think about parental effects. While a close attachment to parents may be vital for children to aid in their survival prospects when they're young, that doesn't necessarily hold over the course of a child's entire life. That is, what's important for successful navigation at one stage in life doesn't always remain important at all, or important to the same extent, for other stages of life. Put plainly, when children are young, they're not trying to be good little adults. They're trying to be good children. That stage of life has its own challenges they have to overcome, with its own sets of needs and its own sets of rules for behavior. Similarly, children aren't developing to be better children at later stages in their life. They aren't learning how to most effectively cry as an adult so they get better at bringing their mom to run to take care of them. People are learning how to exist in the social world they're going to find themselves in. The relationship that a child's going to have with their parents is only one of many different relationships they may have over the course of their life, and the things that work in one relationship, as we covered, don't always work elsewhere. And also, I suppose, as we covered, the relationship that children have with their parents is going to differ from the relationship they have with non-family members, because that degree of genetic relatedness is, of course, different between these relationships. But the matter goes even deeper, though perhaps more simpler than that on a fundamental level, which is that if you think about over the course of our species' evolutionary history, and even today in a modern world, children will have occasionally needed to have survived without their parents from time to time. Whether because of a romantic or social separation between their biological mother and father, or from their mother and father, that is, maybe their parents separated socially, maybe they were separated from their parents socially even if their parents stayed together, or, as was frequently the case, one or both of their parents may have died. That probably wasn't that uncommon over the course of our species' evolutionary history. If a human child's development depended so critically on inputs from both of its parents, and from those parents specifically and not other sources, These children that occasionally and likely frequently suffered some degree of distance from their parents would have been at a massive disadvantage throughout their life. Because you're thinking about life hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years ago. Parents are going to be busy raising other children and not just you. They're going to be attending to other important tasks of their life, collecting food, managing their social relationships. They're going to be separating from each other. Pair bonds don't always last forever. And sometimes your parents are going to be dying. Your parents cannot be there for you each moment of every day to guide you through life. Children needed to, and still need to, rely on other sources of information to learn appropriately. So if it's not the parents that are socializing these children or shaping their personalities in the long term, what factors are accomplishing those tasks? And as Judith notes, there are, of course, the genes that we're born with that are going to predispose us towards certain developmental paths. But like all things in life, these genes depend critically on the environments we find ourselves in. And within this long list of environmental variables that matter, it's not necessarily how your specific parents reared you that matters in the long term, but rather your place in the social world outside of that family. That's what's going to be doing the socialization and the personality structuring. Specifically, what Judith posits is that the environments children inhabit with their peers are the primary drivers of these developmental outcomes. Put in primate terms first here. If you take a monkey in a lab, where you can control the environment of everything going on, and you don't much mind making monkeys miserable for the sake of knowledge, you may find that monkeys raised without mothers tend to be fairly miserable early in life, because an infant separated from its mother is at a large risk of a number of bad things happening to it in natural circumstances. So monkeys raised without mothers tend to be kind of miserable early in life. It's distressing for them. But if you raise them with, say, 3 or 4 other infant monkeys, they ultimately turn out fairly normal in older life when they're interacting with other monkeys. Their early unhappiness in life, due to the absence of a mother, doesn't seem to follow them into the realms of how they socialize and develop later in life. And the same cannot be said, however, of monkeys raised with mothers, but without peers. That is, monkeys that are raised with their mothers alone have a happier early go of things. They're around their mother, the mother's taking care of them, great. But they also tend to show profound social deficits around other monkeys as they get older. As Judith puts it, a mother cannot act as a substitute for peers, but peers can sometimes act as a substitute for a mother when it comes to reaching these important developmental milestones. The argument that she puts forth is that children's socialization takes place largely within groups of that child's peers, specifically groups of relatively same-aged peers, but it can vary a bit. And it's these groups that are socializing children rather than effects going from parents to children directly. It's the people you associate with and the groups you cognitively identify with that socialize you. And it's within those groups that you develop as a unique individual. So, peer play groups appear to be a cross-cultural universal in humans, and you also see it in a variety of other primate species. Young children appear almost inexorably drawn towards each other when they have any choice as to who they're going to associate with, to the point that children are going to begin to actively and regularly seek out interactions with their similarly aged peers away from their parents, even from relatively young ages. And it's through these interactions and observations within these peer groups that children are going to learn and become socialized. The younger children appear to learn from those of about the same to slightly older ages, and those slightly older children tend to learn from each other and those of slightly older ages, and so on. So when it comes to play, for instance, children appear to show a distinct preference for playing with their same-aged peers relative to playing with their parents or other adults when they have a choice. Indeed, this preference for similarly aged peers can sometimes actually be strong enough to cross species barriers at times. That is, it's been observed in the wild that young chimps and young baboons have sometimes been observed to play with each other when the opportunity presents itself. The relative age of these two animals appears to be a very important factor. But one might wonder why, if parents were truly the most important drivers of socialization, children wouldn't naturally just prefer to play with their parents and spend more time with them relative to their similarly aged peers. That is, we might expect, say, teenagers wouldn't need curfews because they would rather be home spending time with their mom and their dad than out with their friends. Yet this isn't really what we see. As soon as children can start moving around the world on their own, sure, they'll come home to eat and sleep, but when they have the opportunity, they usually prefer to be out around the company of other children about their same age. So while young infants might want to have their parents, usually their mothers, close by when they're playing as a form of protection, because the mother will take care of them if they need it, their primary interest appears not to be playing with their mother, but playing with the other kids that are around them. The bond between the parents and the offspring is very real and important in that respect, because it's contributing to the child's happiness and safety, especially when they're young, but it doesn't appear to be the force that's socializing them. Put simply, again, this is because how your mother treats you simply isn't that good of a predictor as to how your siblings are going to treat you, or strange adults are going to treat you, or your babysitter, or your future romantic partner, or your similarly aged peers. Your relationship with mother is simply not that good of a template to base all your subsequent relationships on, because not everyone is like your mother. A better template for how other people are going to treat you and expect you to behave would be some aggregate of how others in your social world behave and how they expect you to behave and treat you. And that appears to be developed through this interaction with our peers. However, there are a great many people in this world with a great many idiosyncratic series of behaviors and expectations. People are different. And what counts as appropriate behavior in one context may be inappropriate in another. So how do humans decide who to model their behavior after? How do we figure out what's expected of us and whether to meet those expectations or ignore them? And to understand that, we have to take this little quick detour into some facts about human groupishness in general. I know groupishness is not exactly a word, but it gets the point across well. Being a member of a group in this case being 3 or more people. 2 is a pair, 3 or more is a group. Being a member of this group can carry massive social benefits. Just like a friend can provide invaluable assistance and social benefits that were previously unattainable, such as things like mutual aid, reciprocal altruism, or simply the fact that 2 people tend to be better at beating someone up than one person is. This general logic extends into broader groups and alliances as well. 3 people are better at dominating one person. 3 people can sometimes even dominate a pair of 2. 4 people hold even more power, and so on up the line. Being a member of a group is so important for humans because the absence of group membership leaves us in extremely vulnerable positions where we can be exploited by others, human and non-human alike. This vulnerability is an issue both with respect to those within our village, the people that you live around, as well as risks from outside villages, your neighbors. Because people within, and especially people without, from without your group, might not have that much of an issue killing you. In turn, that creates a very great psychological motivation to become accepted by others, both through the positive feelings, it feels good to achieve that goal and be accepted, and the negative motivational feelings of being lonely or depressed or anxious when you're on your own, of failing to achieve this goal. It feels good to be a member of a group and bad to be rejected by others, so we naturally tend to do things that reach towards this goal of acceptance and avoid that rejection. And this acceptance critically depends on adopting behavioral norms and attitudes of the group we associate with. You have to embrace the factors that make members more similar and exaggerate them in yourself. And indeed, this groupish behavior can be triggered artificially, and it doesn't take very much. In one such experiment, they took 14 and 15-year-old students from the same school, and they brought them into the research lab, as they do, and they were asked to do a task, which is to estimate the number of dots that flashed on a screen. So you see a group of dots flash for a second. Your job is to say about how many were there. Some of the students were told they were overestimators. Other students were told they were underestimators. And this feedback was completely arbitrary and not tied to their actual performance. The students didn't know that, but they just lied to them and said artificially, okay, you're an overestimator, you're an underestimator based on your responses. The real task is that they subsequently asked these students to compensate each other for their performance in this task. Not in person, in a very impersonal way. So, how much should underestimator 1 get paid? How much should overestimator 1 get paid? How much should underestimator 5 get paid? And so on for their role in this experiment. Without even knowing who was a member of each group, whose payments they were being asked to determine, without any history of friendship among these artificial groups, without any conflict against other groups, or any other apparent differences, the students still tended to discriminate in favor of their own group. Overestimators said other overestimators should be paid more, and underestimators said underestimators should be paid more. And conversely, the underestimators said the overestimators should be paid less, and vice versa. Triggering this groupish psychology that we have appears relatively simple, even within extremely arbitrary contexts. And so with this appreciation of the importance of group membership and the knowledge that these groupish behaviors can be triggered so readily simply by getting someone to cognitively identify with membership in that group, the next step is figuring out how and why people choose which groups to associate with. And I say groups, plural, because humans live in a very complex social world in that respect. The number of groups that we might identify with span a spectrum not just from family to village or tribe, but also among things like political affiliations or sports teams or preferences for entertainment, what job you have, how old you are, what's your gender, what are your hobbies, pretty much along any other line that human behavior naturally varies and we have a category for, we tend to find a group around it. So which groups we identify with can and do shift from time to time, from day to day, even moment to moment, depending on our current context. And make no mistake, this ability to mentally switch your group affiliation quickly based on your context is an extremely useful feature rather than some odd psychological quirk. And if you think about why, consider about how important it can be for individuals to compete with one another for status within a group. That is, you and your 5 friends are hanging out and you want to establish some type of hierarchy. Who's the leader, who's the bottom, and everyone in between. And that's going to involve some conflict and people constantly jockeying for status. But you have to also be able to put those differences aside and come together as a group when you're faced with an external threat, like, say, a raiding party from a neighboring village. Without the ability to quickly change and coordinate your behavior with other people efficiently, your ability to respond to the presence of novel threats can be severely impeded, and you can be too slow to act, and that's costly right up until the point of death. Those who are able to quickly shift their social roles and coordinate their behavior with others based on the circumstances they find themselves in should likely be expected to carry some adaptive advantages. So we might expect then that there are certain features of the world we pick up on to inform us where our most likely group membership resides in that moment. Who is our group right now, and who is our group in the next minute, and so on. There are some relevant features we share with some people, but not everybody. And those can determine where shared group interests are likely to reside. For example, let's say you have a room with several children and several adults. In this room, age is a very relevant factor, and groups may form along age lines. Children, being more like each other, will pick up on this age factor and associate with other children preferentially, whereas the adults probably going to do the same. The adults are going to go sit in the kitchen and drink and chat, and the kids are going to go play together. That's what happens in a mixed age type of group. However, if you have a room where you have, say, only those same age children, age is no longer a relevant factor along which groups are going to form because everyone shares age. Now groups might start forming among different lines, such as gender, simply because age is no longer relevant. And with enough opportunities for interactions, you may also find groups forming along lines of hobbies, academic performance, sports participation, pretty much anything else that creates shared interests and shared goals. And what's clear in both cases is that when people identify with a group mentally, they tend to become more similar to members of that group and less like members of other groups. Similarities tend to be enhanced, differences tend to be widened. Given the benefits of belonging to groups and being accepted by the members of those groups, it should really come as little surprise that people can begin to assimilate the norms from that group into their mental life. Once you identify with the group, it begins to shape your behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and personalities towards that group's average. And it also informs you how to behave around other people in general if you want to be accepted by them. In other words, groups are socializing their members to become more similar. And this socialization, especially among young children, appears to take some type of majority rule for shaping its course. That is, each children is going to bring a host of unique features with them concerning their preferences, their beliefs, their attitudes, their language that they speak, and so on. Every child in that group is going to start out unique, and then they're going to come together. So some of these unique features that children are bringing to the group may be things they picked up at home from their relationships, say, with their parents. And once the children get into these groups, whatever they share with each other tends to be maintained, and the things that are more idiosyncratic get discarded. Again, we can put this in a language example, make it clear. If all the children in an area speak English because they learn to speak English from their parents, then when the children come together in a group, they will continue to speak English, and they will learn from each other. They don't need to learn a new language because they already share one in common. You don't need to invent something you already all share. So that might make language look like a parent-to-child effect. But it could also be a child-to-child effect, a child-to-peer effect. And the real test comes, as we saw before, when a minority of children within that group speak a language. If one child speaks Spanish at home with their parents, but the peer group that they find them in speaks English, that child will generally blunt or stop learning Spanish and learn to speak English as their actual native language. The majority language of the peer group tends to become the native language for all the children within it. And this development will also happen in spite of parental effects to get the child to keep learning the parent's language. When parents and peers are pulling in the same direction, when all the parents and all the kids speak English, it's impossible to determine whether the kids are learning English from their parents or their peers. When parents and peers pull in opposite directions, the group of peers tends to win. Children will bring the language of their peers home with them rather than the language of their parents out with them. And as it happens with language, so too does it happen with a host of other things: styles of dress, behaviors, beliefs, attitudes, even preferences for food. That is, sometimes parents may struggle getting their children, say, to eat their vegetables. And on that front, there's some interesting research by Leanna Birch, 1980, and she was surveying children as to their preferences for vegetables. Questions like, do you prefer vegetable A or vegetable B? Whatever A and B happen to be. So let's say you have a child that prefers eating broccoli to spinach. If you take that child and you seat them at a group of 3 or 4 other children with the opposite preference, these children like spinach instead of broccoli, and let each child choose what they want to eat, you'll find that over the course of a few days, the children with the minority preference begin to largely shift towards the majority preference. If that single child that preferred broccoli to spinach starts out selecting broccoli, and everyone else at the table is eating spinach instead, you'll find that the broccoli eater shifts towards the spinach eater's preference a lot more often than the spinach eaters shift towards the broccoli preference. And anecdotally, you can also see this with styles of dress. That is, if you have children, you may have experienced this yourself, or even if you think back, way back, to being a child yourself. It's a very common outcome for children to be embarrassed about how their parents dress them when they're going out with their friends. This is something we've probably all experienced in some form or another. This is the result of children not wanting to dress to be like their parents, but wanting to dress to be like the members of their peer group. When these two forces are coming into conflict, children are usually favoring the style of dress of their friends and their peers, and they do what they can to subvert parental dress codes. Similarly, you might also think about when a parent complains about how their child was so wonderful and then they left and went to college and then they came back with all these different ideas about life. That, again, seems to have to do a lot with how children begin to associate and identify with new peer groups and adopt the norms of those peer groups rather than maintaining what the parents feel they have instilled within them. Now, this socialization, these groups becoming more similar to their collective membership, is achieved through multiple directions and is usually done without conscious awareness, but may be done with it. So on the one hand, you have people that are beginning to willingly tailor their own behavior to that of their peers to win the group acceptance. This is people, in essence, kind of socializing themselves. They see what their peers are doing, they see how their peers are behaving, they want to be like their peers, and so they adopt the behavior of those peers actively without any real encouragement. We'd prefer others to like us, generally speaking, consider us to be part of the group to which we belong, and so we take active steps towards being like them. On the other hand, those who fail to conform to the behavioral expectations and rules of their groups tend to be met with rejection, mockery, or sometimes even aggression. And this negative form of peer pressure can prove motivating all the same because it represents this threat of being rejected by the other group members, not being considered one of them, and that rejection comes with all the vulnerabilities and costs associated with being left out alone without the group. Importantly, being a member of a group in this context refers to a cognitive identification with that group, rather than a physical gathering of people. That is, you can still consider yourself a boy or a girl, even if members of that group tend to reject you, even if you don't know all the members of that group, or even if you haven't met that many other people of that group. You don't need to like the individual group you're associated with in order to be socialized by them. So long as you consider yourself a part of that group, consciously or not, you tend to adopt the norms of it to keep yourself in better standing. So that is, a girl may still think of herself as a girl, even if the other girls in her classroom don't like her, and she will still become more like the other girls in the classroom. And on the subject of boys and girls, another very interesting tendency tends to crop up with respect to groupishness, which is not only do people tend to see themselves as more similar to members of their own group, but they tend to see their group as more different than other groups, and they can heighten existing differences between them or even create differences between them over time where there were no actual differences before. So, for instance, many parents might be able to tell you this, but when there are enough young girls and young boys around, to the point that boys and girls can form different groups, they tend to do so almost automatically. And once that happens, the sons may begin to express a rather strong disinclination from playing with certain toys, or engaging in certain behaviors, or wearing certain clothes because those are girl things. And girls may do the same thing, just with boys. That is, a young girl may insist she doesn't want to play with a toy because that's a toy for boys, even if such ideas were never expressed by her parents. In fact, she may insist that that's a boy's toy, even if her parents are explicitly telling her the opposite, that anyone can play with any toy, and there's not a boy's toy. She's not buying it when parents say that. And this is largely the result of children modeling their beliefs and attitudes on those of their peers rather than their parents. Children are picking up on these differences between groups and they are exaggerating them, despite the parents sometimes trying to pull in the opposite direction. Again, when the attitudes and preferences and beliefs begin to conflict between parents and peers, the peers almost always win. Now, within these groups that are making us more similar to other group members, there's also a process of differentiation that takes place, where members of a group, to some extent, begin to also pull apart from each other. They begin to become different from each other. That is, in a room of enough young boys and girls, gender becomes a very salient method of categorizing a group, and the boys tend to go in one direction and the girls tend to split up into another. And the boys tend to become more similar to other boys, and the girls tend to become more similar to other girls. However, if all the girls end up in the same area then, and there are no boys around, or vice versa, boys end up over here and there aren't many girls around, gender is no longer that useful for determining your behavior. Within that single sex group, members begin to think of themselves more as individuals, more as people, more as me, than as a member of that group when both boys and girls are around. So when people start thinking more in terms of their individual characteristics, they begin to become a little bit different from each other. Whether that means, for lack of a better word, becoming better, such as I'm the fastest person here, I'm the strongest, I'm the smartest, I look the best. Or perhaps simply doing something unique that other people don't do. Being the class clown, having knowledge of some specific skill set. People tend to differentiate themselves a little bit that way. And this contrasting effect of becoming more similar to the group when group is relevant and becoming less similar to members of the group when groupishness is not relevant can be thought of as trying to be a member of the group when group support is most vital. That is, when group of people A will interact with group of people B, group membership is very important, you become more similar. But when group A is on its own and they're not interacting with B, members of that group begin to start climbing the status hierarchy, and they start breaking off into smaller coalitions when this groupishness is not as vital. That is, think about like a sports team practicing. During practice, some members of a sports team may come into conflict with each other because one person wants to be the quarterback, but so does this person, and they need to settle that in some capacity. They need to come into conflict and jockey for status. But when that team is going to be playing against another team, these personal social status conflicts have to take a back seat in order to achieve coordination and associated victories. And while these lines aren't always very clear-cut in the social world, it's usually a mix between I'm thinking of myself in terms of this group and myself as an individual. These two different tasks of being a group member and being an individual person and climbing that status hierarchy highlight why people, tend to become more similar to each other or slightly different from each other into more unique people based on circumstance. However, in both cases, it's these interactions within the peer group that Judith posits begin to make the long-term changes to people's personalities, attitudes, beliefs, and so on. When you see long-term changes in people, changes that appear to cut across larger swaths of life, it's usually the case they're picking these up through interactions and identifications with other peer groups, rather than from their parents, or in some cases even from their friends. That is, while interactions between specific friends can indeed be meaningful and useful and make people happier, Judith posits even pair friendships aren't the long-term shapers of personality or the forces of socialization. And she believes, actually, the extent to which friends begin to resemble each other over time, that's more often because those friends tend to share a peer group rather than because that two-person relationship is actually causing the socialization to happen. And the logic there is very similar to the parent logic, which is that what's expected out of you behaviorally in a specific friendship is usually specific to that friendship and may not generalize well outside of it. Knowing how to be an effective member of a group is different than knowing how to be friends with a specific person. And these group membership and friend membership tasks are different problems that require different cognitive mechanisms to solve. And the cognitive groups that we perceive and identify with appear to be the forces of socialization, which can differ from your behavior within friendships. Now, all of this previous analysis pushes us towards some interesting conclusions, which is that, I think chief among these, if you as a parent want to influence the development of your child with respect to their socialization and personality, you can do it, but the effects are almost always going to be indirect. That is, you will be unable to directly socialize your child into the type of person you would rather they become, but if you can exert influence over which peer groups they identify with, you can guide development that way. For example, if you consider the Hasidic Jewish community, you're going to find that the Hasidic children end up looking quite a lot like their parents in terms of how they dress, how they talk, how they think, how they behave, and all of those things within that community are quite different from the external community. And here's a case where you have this very atypical, or at least a cultural minority of adults that appear to successfully raise a cultural minority of children. The culture of the parents becomes socialized into the culture of the children here. And this outcome is achieved through very harsh community-enforced controls. That is, children from Hasidic communities are schooled with other Hasidic children, and not with the broader population outside of that community. They live in communities with other children like them, and they do not integrate with the majority community outside of that culture. So when all of the children within this isolated community come together, they all happen to share a culture that they got from their parents. And what is shared tends to be maintained within peer groups. It's only once children begin to engage in behaviors with their peers that differ from those of their parents that the parental behaviors get shed. If those differences are never allowed to arise in the first place, you can maintain unique cultures. So to the extent then that some people end up bicultural, that is, usually because they have peers from two separate cultural groups, not because they picked up the culture from their parents and a separate culture from their peers, but rather they picked up one culture from one set of peers and a second culture from a second set of peers. Think about it this way, that if you had a Chinese family that immigrated to America and they settled in a predominantly Chinese neighborhood, this can allow the children of these immigrants to socialize with other immigrants from the same place. And within that group, they can maintain some of the social practices and culture they share with their parents. But if those children are subsequently going to school in a more diverse ethnic population, where they can't form social groups along those same lines, they tend to end up with a different set of socialization norms they pick up there. And so this can leave children sometimes socialized in a bicultural way because they have peers from two separate groups, and within these groups, what is shared is maintained. However, if that same immigrant family, say, settles in the broader community, rather than in a community of those same immigrants, that same immigrant group, there aren't going to be enough other immigrant children around to form a peer group, and peer groups will form in different lines, and the culture of the parents will be discarded in favor of the culture of the peers outside the home. And the logic of the relative importance of peer groups and parental nurturing can extend outward to other issues as well. That is, take single parenthood, for instance. It can be noted that children of single parents, such as, say, children of divorce, may frequently end up worse off than children whose parents remain together. But if you've been following everything we've been saying so far, that's probably not because of how the parents are raising them, at least not directly with respect to those specific parents. So, of course, on a genetic level, there's going to be some resemblance, and parents who divorce are likely to some extent genetically different than parents that stay together. The tendency to divorce is just not randomly distributed between people. And because children have similar temperaments to their parents in terms of how they might manage stress, or relationships, or aggression, or infidelity, and so on, they tend to resemble their parents. Taller parents have taller children. Parents who are better at managing relationships tend to have children that do likewise, regardless of what home they're raised in. However, there are other important factors to consider when you think about single parents. For instance, raising a child on one income, or sometimes even less than that, is usually a difficult task compared to raising this child with, say, two incomes. And this shift in income level that tends to be associated with divorce can matter a lot. It can involve changes in lifestyle to suit that more modest salary. And this can include very important factors like, say, where one lives, which in turn affects where one goes to school and what peer culture that child is exposed to. This reduced financial status can affect a child's status within their peer group because they might be more capable of fitting in if they can afford the same clothes other people are wearing or attend the same events other people are attending, and factors like this. And to make matters even worse, when children move, the peer groups they were a part of are broken off in favor of the new peer groups they move to. That is, if you move from New York to Florida, your New York friends stay in Florida, your New York peers stay in Florida, and now you have to adjust to your new life in your new location around new peers with new socialization norms. And frequently moving kids around tends to be pretty bad for these kids' social lives, as it becomes progressively harder and harder to fit in with crowds that just keep changing. And if you don't fit in, you get rejected socially, with all the bad outcomes that follow. And further, when there's a divorce and people have to move because their financial situation has taken a turn for the worse, these moves are not usually into well-off, affluent areas full of peers that behave themselves at school and are less physically aggressive. Quite the opposite, usually. People tend to move to poorer neighborhoods inhabited by people that tend to have harder times managing their finances because of other personality traits, say, related to temper and aggression and how they manage stress. And those are the peers that your child will begin to associate with. So in this case, we can see it's not necessarily that single parenthood is causing the bad outcomes for the children through how they're raised by the single mother or how they might lack a father figure, but rather because single parents are worse off financially or socially, which results in their children preferentially being exposed to different peer groups and being socialized by those different peer groups in new ways. You put a child around delinquent peers, you're likely going to shape that child into a delinquent themselves, both because of that peer group's treatment of the child and the child's natural desire to be like its peers. If you put a child around other children who end up criminals or drug users or are aggressive, you're more likely to get those same behaviors out of the child, even if you keep your home environment exactly the same with the same parents. And that's true, as Judith notes, of children living in bad neighborhoods. they tend to turn out the same whether they're raised by two or single-parent homes within that bad neighborhood. Within the neighborhood, the single or together status of the parent begins to matter quite a lot less. So that children tend to resemble the peers around them regardless of whether they're being raised by one or two parents. And the more you start controlling for these exposures to different peer groups, the less parents seem to impact the equation. So if you want to shift a child's course developmentally away from delinquency, find a way to get that child around less delinquent peers and into more stable social situations with better behaved peers. And for an example of this in action, we can look at a 1992 paper by McGew and Licken. They were surveying about 1,500 same-sex twin pairs. That is, identical twins and non-identical twins. And they were being assessed on the question of divorce. They're using twins here to try and control for these genetic factors, because we know parents tend to resemble their offspring. And so if you can look at twin pairs, identical and non-identical, you can control for these genetic factors to a better degree. So what they found is, in general, if the parents of these twins stayed together, their children later went on to divorce about 20% of the time. But if their parents were divorced, the twins tended to get divorced about 30% of the time. It was almost a 10% increase in divorce if your parents were divorced. Now we have a parent-to-child effect of divorce. Children are learning about relationships at home and taking it out into the world. If my parents got divorced, I should get divorced. But not so fast, because children are getting their genes from their parents too. Parents who divorce can also pass on the genetic traits that contribute to this outcome of getting divorced, be that through different temperaments or preferences or whatever it is. So what happens is, if you looked at identical twins, those that shared 100% of their genes, you can start to control for these factors. In this case, among identical twins with divorced parents, if your twin also got divorced, your odds of getting divorced increased 5.3 times. However, what if your parents stayed together, but your twin got divorced? Then your chances of getting divorced increased 5.4 times. 5.3, 5.4. Didn't seem to matter whether the parents were staying together. Once you control for shared genes, whether the parents stayed together or not seemed to have no impact whatsoever on divorce rates. Same story emerged for twins that only shared 50% of their genes. If their parents were divorced and your twin got divorced, you were 1.8 times more likely to get divorced. If your parents stayed together and your twin got divorced, 1.8 times as likely to get divorced. Indeed, as the researchers in this paper estimated, the effect of the shared environment, what the twins had in common, like what household they were raised in, had roughly 0 noticeable predictive effects. Once you take shared genes into account, parental divorce seemed to have no impact at all on the twins' risk of getting divorced. And for such a monumental change, parents splitting up, for such a monumental change in parenting behaviors, you might expect some rather large, or at least some impact, but it simply wasn't there. While parental divorce may certainly make children unhappy, because it can disrupt those personal family relationships and mess up your satisfaction within the home, it didn't appear to be following them outside of the home, outside of those specific family relationships. By contrast, to the extent that divorce disrupts the outside the home environment by changing which peer groups you're a part of, or requiring physical moves frequently away from groups into new groups, this is where we start to see the longer-term effects of divorce. So what can parents impart to their children? Where are the effects of the parents? Now, as Judith reviewed here, it's possible for parents to impart a lot to their children if they can engage in some serious peer group control and ensure that the child's peer group shares all or most of the important things in common with each other, because what's common in peer groups tends to be retained. So if parents can pick their children's peers in some capacity through, say, homeschooling with a very select group of other children, or raising them in particular communities away from outside influences, parents can definitely exert effects indirectly. Indeed, actually, parents can actually mess up their children's development to a large extent if they keep them away from peers entirely. So parents can work to exert influences by ensuring their peers socialize their children in the right way, and parents can exert effects through ensuring their children don't get socialized at all, which will really mess them up. But that's probably not what they're going for. But the other thing that can be passed from parents to children effectively are behaviors that are irrelevant to the peer group. That is, behaviors enacted primarily in the home that stay at home, or perhaps behaviors that the peer group simply doesn't need to share. So, for instance, children need to share a language, so they learn the language of their peers and bring it home to their parents instead of the other way around. But children don't need to share all their hobbies. So a child that learns to play an instrument at home may retain that interest in the peer group, and they may especially retain it if being a proficient musician is valued by their peers socially. Or maybe if a child picks up some idea about what job they want to have in the future, that may be retained to the extent their peers don't disapprove of that career, or they don't care about it because that has little to do with how their day-to-day goes on. If you want to be a doctor in the future, but being a doctor has nothing to do with your peer group, you can retain that from your parents because your peers don't demand any conformity on it. So parental impacts, in other words, can be felt on the children, but these impacts largely extend only to the boundary of the things the peer group tends to care about. Once the peers start wanting something different out of the child than the child tends to fall in line with the peers and tends to discard the parents. And I do want to end this on a rather important point, which Judith highlights because this does come up a lot when people hear about what she says, which is that whether or not parents shape the personalities of their children or act as their long-term socializers, and from what we've seen today, it certainly appears parents don't have the role that's often attributed to them there. This is not to say that parents are unimportant to children or it doesn't matter how the parents treat their children. Parents are quite important. There's a great deal of importance in ensuring your child's physical needs are met, and that can also help ensure their emotional needs are met as well. That is, if you want your child to spend more time being happy anyway. Parents can influence the type of environments that children grow up in and the peers they tend to spend time around, exerting their indirect effects. And even if the parents aren't the long-term shapers of that child's personality when the child is not around them, the child does still spend some time around their parents. That is, the parents will shape how the child behaves in the context that they're together, and how the child feels when they're together. And those interactions between parents and kids can produce some rather immediately and keenly felt pleasures and pains. If a child spends 10% of the time with their parents over the course of their life, the parents might not control the other 90%, but they can make that 10% pretty great or pretty miserable for everyone involved, depending on how they treat each other. It's not okay for parents to be cruel or harm their children for the same reason it's not okay for anyone to be cruel and harm other people. Just because you may not be the sole influence shaping socialization and personality of your friends or your romantic partners across all contexts, across all time, that doesn't mean it's not important how you treat them or what you do with them. It matters how parents treat their children for the same reason it matters how we all treat each other. It affects how happy we are when we're around each other and how much everyone wants to be together.